Okay, so we are back and we're looking again at 1 Corinthians, talking about the significance of context, and we're looking at really kind of a controversial section here, the head covering section. I asked you to read through it just now so that you could kind of get a feel for what Paul is arguing, and what I'd like you to now tell me from what it looks like in the passage. What do you think is going on here? Is this something that every church should be doing right now? In other words, is it a transcultural command? Is it something universal that should be happening in every church everywhere all the time? Or is this a cultural situation that only applied in Paul's day, but maybe has some universal principles that we can take out of, and it would have to be applied differently in our culture than it was in his culture? So, obviously we don't just throw the scriptures out. Everything is there for a reason, but we might have to do a little bit more digging to understand how this connects to us if it's not just a straightforward command, if it is culturally bound. So, from the context, what would you say?
My brain is working. A long time ago, I was in a Bible study that covered this, and we believe the explanation was that in that culture, in that time, when a woman didn't have a head covering, it signified that she was a prostitute.
Okay. So, getting to some historical background, there's been a suggestion, maybe something indicated prostitution if the woman's head wasn't covered. So that's part of what may be going on here. So in that case, it would have been a cultural thing, because it doesn't mean that now in our situation culturally, right? So then that command for a woman to cover her head when she was praying or prophesying would not be related to our situation today. Anybody else? See anything else there in the passage that may give you clues? Remember, immediate context is very important. Talked about historical context and literary context both being necessary to understand and interpret. Okay.
I think it was both cultural and charismatic.
Okay.
I think their norm was for women to cover their heads and whatnot, but I think looking at verse 3, that the man is ahead of woman, and Christ is ahead of them, and when it talks about him praying or prophesying, I think it signifies that he is ahead, he's a spiritual leader, and the woman, she's not underneath, but he's a spiritual leader over her.
Okay.
And so
Okay.
I think metaphorically it's just talking about within the structure of family or structure of marriage.
Okay.
In that context, I guess.
Okay. So to sum up, maybe you're saying this only makes sense if it was in the cultural setting, because it, for them back then, there were some messages being communicated, but maybe there's a deeper spiritual principle here that's highlighting role differences between men and women, spiritual headship of a man, that kind of thing. Okay, excellent. All right, so what we're wrestling with right now are these contextual issues. History, immediate context. We're going to look at grammatical context, some other things. So let's just kind of walk through this very quickly. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but if you want to come back to this, we can. This is one of those passages that gets a lot of focus from a lot of different groups, and I think some deal with it better than others because of these contextual issues. So if this is something you want to dive down deeper into next week, let me know, and we'll do that. Let's take a look at verse 2. In the NIV, I'm not sure how some of the other versions read it. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions. Does that sound like laws? No. Traditions. So obviously there's something going on. It's not a part of God's law. We look at the biblical context, again, there's nothing in anywhere, Old Testament, New Testament, other than this passage that speaks about head coverings. Okay? So there's no law about that. Paul himself calls it a tradition. So there we have a clue this is something cultural going on. Okay? So looking at the immediate context of where this is happening, we pick up some of these key words. Later on, we see the idea of a symbol, and that is not always translated in every translation. It talks about a woman has something on her head, and some interpreters put in as a symbol. That isn't actually the specific Greek word there, but the concept there flows and fits with what Paul is discussing. And so there's a reasonable explanation for why they include that idea to flesh that out a little bit more. So again, symbolic ideas doesn't necessarily represent law or order, a command from God. It's representing something that's being communicated through that image. Okay? That doesn't communicate that in our culture anymore, right? In that culture, it very clearly did, not just in the Christian church, but in the pagan churches, temples. Ordinance? Interesting. Yeah, that's a poor translation. Yeah. So, that's not surprising out of the King James, though. Because of where they were coming from theologically, they did some things there. So we have some of this immediate context that's helping us understand, okay, maybe this is just cultural. Even though Paul is referencing things that seem universal. You know, the head of Christ is God, and the head of the church is Christ, and the head of a woman is man. Therefore, a woman should wear a head covering. Okay? But we understand from the culture that was a universal practice back then. It no longer is here in our modern world. But there are groups that will take a look at this. In fact, when we were doing missions work in Ukraine, a lot of the churches there, in fact, almost all of them, demanded this because of this passage. One thing about Slavic cultures, they are very, very literal. They have a hard time with metaphor. They have a hard time with symbolism. If it says it, then that's what it is. And so just culturally, we had to understand that and deal with that. But I think Trinity is right about this. As we get into the context and we look at some of these issues, I believe it becomes very clear that this is a cultural issue. But there is a bigger principle behind it, a deeper principle, just as she mentioned, that there are some things going on here that address the importance of recognizing within the church there are some God-given structures that God wants us to work within. Now, another interesting thing, looking at grammatical context, this word for women or woman in the passage is the term gune, which often is translated wife. It can be either wife or women generally, and it depends on the context. And so some translations actually say wife, which tends to fit with Paul's other writings, looking at authorial context. Ephesians, he talks about the man or the husband being head of the wife. just as Christ is head of the church. And so it would make sense, if he's using the idea and the concept in that way, that this would apply to wives. A wife has a head over her husband, therefore it's good to reflect that in some way. Back in that day, it was with a head covering. Today, what would that look like? I don't know. But it's useful to think about that. So, we can take a closer look at that if you want to later, but I just wanted to use that as an example, because this is an issue, especially if you're doing mission work in other places, or if you're working with certain denominations, even right here in America. They will focus heavily on that, and it could be offensive to them if we were to walk into their worship setting and not go according to their tradition and worship and pray and prophesy. Okay? Now, getting back to this idea of literary block context. Okay? We're going to talk extensively about that the rest of the session, but I want to highlight something, because that's why it's very important for us to look at these contexts to see what's going on and what the overall message of even just that block of information is looking at. 11 falls within one particular block within this discussion of Paul on ordering the church in a proper way. Okay? And so I would like to suggest, you may disagree with me, and that's okay, because breaking down these different blocks, we have as many different commentators and scholars that will break them down differently as there are people. But I think it's useful, nonetheless, to do something like this. This particular block I see, personally, runs from 11:2 to the end of chapter 14 verse 40. Now, within that section, I'd like us to look at one more controversial piece that also a lot of churches fight over. Let's go to chapter 14 in 1 Corinthians, starting with verse 34. I'm going to look at 34 and 35. Everybody there? Ready? Okay. Women, again, this could be wives, this is the term gune. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak at church. Now, I have been in church worship settings, both here in America and overseas, where they would have a heart attack if a woman stood up where I'm standing now and spoke anything, particularly a word of teaching or preaching, because of these two verses. It's disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. How do we understand this concept and make sense of how we're going to apply that when there's so much disagreement about what that means? I mean, just taking it at face value, if we're going to cherry pick that out of the context, right? A woman should remain silent. They shouldn't speak at all. It's disgraceful to speak. So does that mean women can never speak at church? What do you think? No. Okay, literary context again, right? This block is within that same section where Paul's talking about the head coverings. Do you remember why he said it was important for the women to wear a head covering, or not why, but when when it was important for them to wear a head covering. What did it say in 11? When they're doing what? When they're praying and close, prophesying. Prophesying. So when a woman is prophesying in church, that sounds like speaking to me. Right? Prophesying is often the equivalent of preaching right now. In our modern context, I would argue very strongly that preaching and prophecy are, if not identical, very similar in their function. Okay? So when a woman in chapter 11 is prophesying or praying in the church setting, she should wear a head covering. So it cannot mean a woman should always remain silent in the church. Context. And yet some churches build whole doctrines on this idea that they don't dare let a woman even stand up in front of anybody to speak because of pulling this verse out of context. You see why this is so important? So what is this really saying then? What is it talking about? Let's take a look at the context. Now, remember I told you the grammatical context is important. This term women here, women should remain silent, is the Greek word gune that could mean wives. So let's just insert that into the translation instead. Wives should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission. Come back to that concept again that we saw in chapter 11, right? As the law says, if they want to inquire about something, they should ask their husbands at home, for it's disgraceful for them to speak in church. What does that sound like is going on? The wives want to ask a question. Maybe something came up during the readings, during the prophecy, maybe because of someone, talking about Paul's very letter. And the women wanted to ask a question, some woman or multiple women, and so they start asking their husbands. Now, this gets back to historical context. We know in that day that they separated the men and the women. So women would all sit on one side, men would all sit on the other side. So imagine for a moment if a wife on this side is trying to ask her husband a question while he's sitting on the other side of the church. Hey, Ralph, what's he talking about? Now that changes the whole dynamic of what's going on here. So it's very possible what Paul is doing here is addressing distractions that are occurring because some people are creating outbursts during the worship service rather than waiting until they get home to ask, okay, what was that all about? What's going on here? Further historical context tells us that within the Corinthian church itself were many societally high standing, women of high standing. In other words, wealth, position, power, influence. They, at this particular time in history, we know now because of archaeological evidence, there was a movement among that strata of women, that strata of society, that they were discarding the idea of head coverings. They thought it was outmoded. They didn't want to do it anymore. They wanted to show off their hair because they spent a lot of money on their hair. And just was an old concept. Let's move away from that, get on with the new. Part of that was that they felt privileged to be able to just speak whenever they wanted to as well. And so it's very possible that that cultural historical issue is being addressed by Paul in both of these passages to try to mitigate distractions and other problems that were creating disruption in the church service itself. Remember, this whole block is about how do we do worship and church life the proper way. Okay, that makes sense if we're looking at it in that context. So we can't just pull these verses out and create some elaborate teaching and doctrine and church practice if we don't understand what's really going on. Context, context, context. It's so important as we interpret these things. Okay, so what I'd like to do for the rest of the time is take a look at the literary context and the immediate blocks, the literary blocks of information that we have here, so that we can begin to understand what's really going on with Paul and how he's walking through this information. So, letters, ancient letters, this is typically how they would be structured. We would have a greeting. We would then have a prayer. And this was true not just of biblical letters, this is true in the ancient world generally. So when we're talking about even the pagans that didn't know God, this is the structure, normal structure of a letter in that day. They would include a thanks to the gods. In our case, obviously, it's a thanks to God and Jesus. We see the Lord Jesus Christ referenced in Paul often, and God the Father. Then we have, finally, the content or the body of the letter, where specific issues or situations or concerns, comments, instructions are addressed. Finally, at the very end, we have some final instructions and a final greeting. That's interesting because at the end of our modern letters, we just have a farewell or a sincerely, sign our name. Here, before they gave their name, and Paul will say here in this letter, see how I sign my name in my own handwriting. They have an additional greeting to whoever this letter is going to in the churches, all right? Or whoever the recipient is, if it's one of the letters from outside the church. So, looking at these blocks, let's see if we can identify where these fall. I'd like you to open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Read down through that, chapter 1 there, and see if you see anything that indicates a clear separation. Now we're looking here at the greeting, and then we're going to be trying to identify where the prayer starts. Okay? So take a look on your own, look into the Bible there, see if there's a nice transition point where you would say, okay, that's the greeting, now we're getting into the prayer. Okay, what verse is that? Okay. So it could be 3. So it may be that the greeting is 1:1-3. So if you feel like that, then that's what you would label for your block. Any other ideas? Now that's not necessarily wrong. I'm not saying that there's, just because there's a different one that's wrong. Like I said, we have different designations from every possible author, scholar. Some are more easily recognized than others, but we're not talking about right or wrong here. We're just talking about what you're seeing. Okay? Anybody else? You think the greeting goes a little bit further and the prayer starts somewhere else? Another verse? 4? Okay. So maybe it goes 1-4, and then the prayer starts at verse 5? Okay. The prayer starts at 4? Okay, so that would be the same as what he had mentioned. All right. Anybody else? All right. Well, again, I said there's no right or wrong answer here. I split it off between 9 and 10, and this is my reasoning. He talks about here, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another in what you say. And that really does sound more like a beginning, doesn't it? Yeah, probably you're right. Prayer 4 to 9, we'll say. Okay? Or is it? I would say probably the thanks. Thanks probably starts at 4, doesn't it? Okay. Because he clearly is thanking God there. All right?
For the prayer, verse 3, though.
Verse 3, yeah. Yep. So maybe the prayer is verse 3 and this is 1 to 2. Okay? Now again, not necessarily right or wrong, but what I want you to do is begin to see how these might be broken down so that we can start understanding how to look at these larger blocks. Okay? Now where this really gets more important is the content and the body. This is going to run, I would suggest, from 110 all the way to 16:1, 1558 really, and then 16:1 is where I designated final instructions. Okay, and I think Paul even makes a comment like that. Something along the lines of, these are my instructions to you. So, what I'd like you to do for next week is, as you're reading down through this, go through and take a look at where you would break this down. Again, it's just for your benefit, your purposes. I think that's to 24, if I remember right. Go ahead and try to break this middle section down even further. And I would like to suggest, this again is just my sort of arbitrary idea. I would like to suggest there are 4 major sections in the body itself. Okay? What I see, and I'll just give you this as a breakdown, a major section is divisions and factions with a focus on wisdom and foolishness. And that theme sort of makes up that first block. Okay? So I see that going from 110 to 421. Now the benefit, again, of walking through and putting this together is so that when you look at individual passages, you can come back and say, okay, if this is the larger theme, oh, this makes sense. He's talking about this in terms of what's going on in the church with the factions and the divisions that are being created. You see how that can help? So we are close to running out of time, aren't we? Let me just really quickly give you these last blocks, then we'll wrap it up for the night. Holiness is demanded for public witness. In other words, we need to live a certain way because of our witness to the unbelievers. 1 Corinthians 5. 5:1 through 11:1. C is the block that we were just discussing, proper ordering for the church and the church life. 11:2 to 14:40. And then finally, the day of the Lord. And that's chapter 15, 1 to 58. Okay? So, again, take a look at those passages. Try to come up with your own blocks. If you feel like mine don't fit, that's totally fine. But for your benefit, I'd like you to begin to think in these larger chunks because they are very, very helpful when we're looking at specific verses and ideas to reference, okay, what's going on here? Where else has Paul talked about speaking? Well, he's talked about speaking in tongues. He's talked about prophecy. How does that connect with this idea here? As you're looking in that block, that will help you be able to understand what all is going on there. All right. Thank you so much for your time tonight. We will see you next week.